In the same way, we are utterly unable to be righteous. And we don't think of ourselves that way, do we? We think of ourselves as like kind of sick. I just need a little bit of help. If I just try a little bit harder, if I take a few religion pills, read the Bible a few times, resolve to do better, then I'm going to be able to be okay. Get a little harder and I can get a passing grade on the final exam. God says, you are so off. God's measure of goodness is the 10 Commandments. Listen, recently I was reading something by Martin Luther who said, if you want to stimulate your relationship with God, then for a month, just every morning go through the 10 Commandments in your mind and pray through them. And I thought, well, Martin Luther recommended it. I'll try it. It has been absolutely devastating for me. In the mornings as a part of what we call our quiet time, I've been going through the 10 Commandments because I just realized that there is not a single one of these that I just instinctively and naturally keep. For example, you shall have no other gods before me. I ask myself, do I really love and cherish God more than everything else in my life? Is he the most important? Does he occupy my first thoughts? Is he the most valuable to me? Am I more concerned about his opinion than anybody else's? You shall make no graven images of me. Am I satisfied with God the way that he is? Or am I constantly wishing I could make God into something else? Am I saying, God, why don't you do it this way? God, if you were really good, why don't you give me this? Or why don't you do that? God, if I were God, this is what I do, and I think you should probably do what I think you should do. How about this one? Skip a few. Honor your parents. I ask myself, have I always been submissive to the authorities that God put in my life? That's part of what that commandment's about. Was I submissive to my parents naturally? Am I submissive always to the police, to my teachers, to a boss? In fact, let me rephrase that. Have I ever been naturally submissive to the authorities God has placed in my life? Thou shalt not steal. How many times do I try to appropriate things that don't really belong to me? And when I say that, of course, you got the obvious things like cheating in business or, your taxes or something like that. But how often do I take credit that's not mine and not give credit for an idea because I want somebody to think I'm smarter than I actually am? Do I listen to illegally downloaded music and say, well, it's going to be okay? Do I steal? Thou shalt not lie. How often do I exaggerate the truth to make myself look better or bend the truth to avoid a difficult situation or an awkward encounter? And then I come to thou shalt not commit adultery, and I'm like, I'm feeling pretty good about that one because I've always been faithful to my wife until I see what Jesus said about that one. And Jesus said, yeah, if you've ever looked at somebody who's not your spouse and lusted after them in your heart, then it's like you've committed adultery. And then I come to thou shalt not murder. I'm like, okay, finally one I can put in the W column. Then Jesus says in Matthew, if I've ever desired to see somebody else harmed, and I think about how many times I've rejoiced when somebody I don't like suffered or made me mad, and I thought, well, I can't wait to see what happens to them. I'll get a meteor or something. In fact, there's a German word that I'm trying to teach my kids because it's like the only German word I know. Schadenfreude. You know what that word means? Schadenfreude. It means when you rejoice in somebody else's misfortune. And I'm trying to tell my kids, you should not rejoice when your brother or sister gets in trouble. But actually, I look, as I'm telling them this, saying, this is exactly what I do. I rejoice when somebody else goes through pain sometimes because I have a spirit of violence and murder in my heart, even if I don't commit the act. Thou shalt not covet. Am I always fully satisfied with the situation that God has me in right now and never craving somebody else's income or privileges or talents or success or family situation? And y'all, I'm telling you, when I get done with this list, I realize that I am 0 for 10. When you're 0 for 10 on the final exam, you're not going to pass the class. You say, I'm pretty good except for being instinctively a lying, hateful, pilfering, rebellious, adulterating blasphemer. Except for those little details. You really feel like you're a good person. Jesus said, if so, you're just looking at the wrong standard. Unless you're righteous like your Father in heaven is righteous, you'll never enter heaven. Which brings up another thing. Some of you don't trouble yourself with the 10 Commandments. You just come up with your own standard of what it makes for a good person. Then you think, well, as long as I live up to that standard, God's going to let me in. Two problems with that. First of all, you made it up. Seriously, come on. Where else does that work in life? Now, imagine you show up at Duke University as a freshman and you sit down and the teacher says, I don't have you registered. And you say, I didn't apply. And your teacher says, well, we require this on the GPA and this on your SAT. And you're like, I didn't do any of those things. But I'm just wicked good at ballet. And I thought I belong at Duke University. And that's my standard. I mean, it's not going to work. Why would you think that in heaven, God's like, hey, man, just whatever works for you. Yeah, you passed your own standard? Awesome, come on in. Of course not. Here's the other problem with that. You don't live up to your own standard. If you were honest, you'd give yourself an F half the time at your own standard. The way I've described that to you is if you had a little invisible tape recorder or just some kind of recorder, since nobody knows what a tape is anymore. If you had an invisible recorder around your neck that only activated when you said the word ought, She ought to do that, and he ought to do that, and they ought to do that. And that's all it recorded. And then at the judgment seat, God only judged you by whatever you said somebody else ought to do. There ain't a single one of you in here that would pass that judgment. You see, we, like Abraham, are utterly unable to please God because the problem is not ignorance. The problem is not that we need a little religion pill. The problem is we are dead and we are sinful, and there's nothing we can do to actually change that. The second reason we can't make a deal with God, number two, is that we don't really have anything to offer God anyway. Here's how Paul explained that in verse 4. The one who works, wages are not credited as a gift. They're given as an obligation. Right? If a plumber comes over to my house and works on something and he hands me a bill for $80, I don't say, man, here's your gift. I say, he's like, this is what he did the work, I owe him. And we think of heaven in those terms, that God is going to owe us heaven because we paid all this good works. Here are two problems with that. First, we don't have anything that God needs. I alluded to this at the beginning, but think how foolish our negotiating sounds. God, you want some obedience? I'll go to church. And God's like, oh, goody, you go to church? I love church. How can I say no to that? You know, I can't refuse. Of course not. We don't have anything by which we can put God in our debt. Second, being good in one area doesn't erase the fact that we broke God's laws in another area. I mean, imagine if you were on trial because you've been caught for assault and battery and breaking and entering. And the judge is about to bring down the gavel, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I know I'm guilty of assault and battery and breaking and entering, but Judge, I only use paper straws that are made from recycled paper, and I always get paper, not plastic. It's better for the environment. I never drink bottles of water, and I have my own compost pile, and I drive a Prius. And, you know, I'm so environmentally, he's going to say, well, that's awesome, but that doesn't change the fact that you broke and entered and hurt somebody. It's irrelevant. So we can't put God in our debt by just covering up disobedience to his standards by some other arbitrary standard that we make for ourselves. Number three, here's the reason Paul says you can't work your way there. This is because God alone will get the glory. God alone has determined he's going to get the glory for all this. Here's how he explains it. Verse 2, if in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. Let me retranslate that. If Abraham had been able to impregnate Sarah by his own power, then he would have boasted to everybody, man, I was 90 and I pulled that off. He said, but here's what, let me translate this, but God will never let that be. God will not let all the credit for the work that he does on earth, and specifically the work of building his kingdom and bringing people to heaven, he's not going to let that be credited to any human being. And if we earn heaven based on what we did, then we would spend a lot of our time in heaven talking about what we did to get ourselves there. We walk up to each other in heaven and say, well, what did you do? Oh, you were faithful to your wife for how long? Oh, you prayed how much? You read how many chapters of the Bible? You wrote how many books? Oh, God must be lucky to have you here. No, the book of Revelation is very clear. I love this. The book of Revelation says that there is one, we wear name tags in heaven. Did you know that? All right, yeah, book of Revelation says you wear a name tag, but it's actually on your forehead. It's tattooed there. And the name that you wear on your forehead is not going to be your own. It's going to be the name of Jesus Christ. Which means that when somebody walks up to me and says, why are you here? I'm not going to talk about JD's name and how awesome he is. I'm going to point to my forehead. I'm going to say, that's why I'm here, because I never sinned. Not one time when I lived. And I actually had so much faith that I walked on water. And the devil tempted me for 40 days in the wilderness, and I would not succumb to his temptation, not even one time. And I was on the cross, and instead of giving hate back to the people that were crucifying me, I said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It is not my name and the record of my deeds or my reputation that is going to earn me my place in heaven. It is Jesus' name that is going to be attached to me, and the righteousness associated with his name, the fact that he died the death I've been condemned to die and lived the life I was supposed to live. That's my name that gets put here. And when people say, why are you in heaven? I'm just going to point to my head and say, that's why I'm here. That's how God has set it up. We get the grace, God gets the glory. We don't earn it, God doesn't owe us. We get the grace, God gets the glory, period. The only kind of people who go to heaven are those that know they don't belong there, who know that there is nothing they can do to fix that or change it, but trust that God, who said he was so gracious that he'd do it for us, actually did what he said he'd do. You cannot earn heaven. You cannot make a deal with God in any shape, form, or fashion. What this passage tells you is that righteousness, and by righteousness, I mean full acceptance by God, is a gift that God gives to us while we are still sinful. That it is possible, Paul says, to acknowledge that you are more guilty and more worthy of condemnation than people could ever imagine. The problem is not that people don't know the real you. The problem is, if they saw the real you, they would know that you'll never get to heaven. You are simultaneously more worthy of condemnation than people have ever imagined, and yet you are more sure that you are loved and accepted by God than anybody ever dreamed possible. Because that status was given to you not on the basis of what you've done or what you deserved. It was given to you on the basis of Jesus Christ, not you. Martin Luther called this the most important and probably the most misunderstood doctrine in the Bible. It is the doctrine, he says, on which the church rises or falls. It is the doctrine which separates true Christianity in its essence from every other religion on earth. Because every other religion on earth, all of them, you can put into one category. You spell them with two letters. And those letters are D-O. D-O is what I do that is going to earn me a place in heaven. Religions are going to substitute out various things for the do part. It's whether you go to mosque or the Eightfold Path or whether you're nice to people, whatever. Right? But it's all characterized by it's what I do that earns me a place in heaven. The gospel is the only one spelled D-O-N-E. It is what Christ has done, Jesus in my place. It is his record that gets attached to me, and it's because of his righteousness that I have assurance before God.